Few of their children in the country learn English. The signs on our streets have inscriptions in both languages. Unless the stream of their importation could be turned, they will soon so outnumber us that all the advantages we have will not be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious. Who said that? Benjamin Franklin. The year was 1750. He was referring to the German immigration in Pennsylvania. And here are the words of John Jay, the first Supreme Court justice, also in that year, 1750, and he said, "We should build a wall of brass around the country because of the Catholic invaders." I guess you could say that America comes by its anti-immigrant sentiment, honestly, at least historically speaking. According to Jennifer Wingard, a professor at the University of Houston, this sentiment translated into the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, an act that was specifically constructed to remove immigrants who were saying things against the U.S. government. Immigrants. You probably know that in the 1830s and in the 1940s, it was famine and political upheaval in both Ireland and Germany that brought a wave of immigrants from those countries whose Catholicism put them at odds with what was then the Protestantism of America. And in reaction, there were riots in places like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts where lives were lost. Reaction was fear-based. And here's what they said: they're taking away our jobs. They are a threat to the social order. And these waves of immigration birthed in response the nativist Native American Party. No, they were not Indian people or indigenous persons, but English-speaking whites. They were very, very secret and denied that they existed at all. So they became known as the Know Nothing Party. We know nothing. The irony of this title and how it seems to be applicable today is not lost on me. I did just say that. But this Know Nothing Party, I mean the Native American Party, was really concerned that these arrivals were not only an economic and a social threat, but that they were going to bring crime, they were going to bring disease, they were going to bring social unrest and possible political takeover. Again, does that rhetoric sound familiar? We also in this country have a habit, as do many other countries, of importing labor from other countries and then passing legislation to restrict immigration based on nationality, often of those whom we imported. I want you to think of the Chinese in particular, that we brought to this country to work and to die, building our Western railroads and to help with harvests. So then we had to apparently create the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. In 1911, the census reported the foreign-born population in this country was 13.5%, the highest it had ever been, and it's the same percentage we have now. Now, after World War I, anti-immigrant sentiment swept across our country, and it gave rise to the birth of extremist groups and also the resurgence of the KKK. And in this country in the 1900s, we kind of had an ambivalent relationship toward the refugees who came to our country seeking refuge from conflicts in their own homes. And the Immigration Act of 1924 set quotas by country of origin and explicitly preferred Northern Europeans over all others. Now, that law was eventually replaced with one that didn't limit immigration based on nation of origin. It seems like we're about to reinstate that. In the 1970s, it was labor groups who were lobbying to restrict immigration because those immigrants were willing to work for less pay. But labor was defeated by agribusiness, who knew they had a good thing going. And so they kept bringing in cheaper immigrant labor. Often, though, as was the case both in New York and Boston, these immigrants were taking jobs that nobody else would. This is what happened in Germany a couple of decades ago. No one would pick up the garbage. They imported Turks. Now they are trying to struggle with what it means to be a German. How should the Turks be incorporated into our society? And how are they taking over our society? And they took these jobs like cleaning stables, unloading ships, and digging trenches. And that's still the case today, that the immigrant often does the dirty work for far less money than those of us who are native born would be willing to do it. So here's the reality. You know this. Human history can be defined by the patterns of migration, emigration, and immigration. As a species, we've never stopped moving, migrating, land to sea, sea to land, and back again. We live in artificially bordered areas that shift with the political tide without taking into account our tribalism or our cultures. We migrate. We move to survive. The reasons for human migration initially were simple. You had to eat. Or maybe there was a shift in the landscape, making it inhabitable, inhospitable. The food source ran out. So migration became a way of life. Today, global migration is the result of what are known as push factors. Not enough jobs, few opportunities, primitive conditions, the deserts that are being created, famine, drought, political fear, persecution, slavery or forced labor, poor medical care, loss of wealth, death threats, lack of political or religious freedom, pollution, poor housing, landlord-tenant issues, discrimination, bullying, poor chances of finding a spouse, condemned housing. And there are also these pull factors. Job opportunities, this is what pulls us. Higher wages, better living conditions, political and/or religious freedom, and quality of life, education, better medical care, attractive climates, security, industry, family ties, better chances of marrying. And there are also these vast floating populations, people moving within a country from rural to urban and urban to rural, those who find seasonal employment in agriculture and tourism. Migration, emigration, and immigration are the norm today globally. The human species is a mobile species, more mobile than ever before. Across the world, we are seeing the popularity of welcoming the immigrant and then the reactionary nativism. So this recent nonsense over American-born Americans and who is really an American ignores the reality of our history. With the exception of indigenous persons, the true Native Americans, Indians, all of us in this country are immigrants. We're all imports. If we were all able to do our family genealogies, we would ultimately find our roots on other continents. All of us. And here's another sad history. Between 1776 and 1887, we immigrants either stole through treaty or executive order or bloodshed all but 8 billion acres of this 2.3 billion acre country from the indigenous persons. And then after we stole it, we forced them into reservations and places that they were not used to. We stripped them of their land. We stripped them of their way of their life, their culture, and their religion. Our government forcibly removed Indian children from their families, from their reservations, and put them in Indian boarding schools, where their language and heritage was literally beaten out of them. This is one way in which countries conquer and dominate. Take away language. Take away all that is familiar in culture. Take away religious customs and traditions. As a colleague, the Reverend Misha Sanders, posted on her Facebook page this week, she said, "There is no such thing as an illegal immigrant who is indigenous to this land. We are the illegals, dear white fam. We, period, are, period, the, period, illegals." And as far as Mexico is concerned, with our troubled history there, you know, it was originally US citizens who immigrated into the area of Mexico that's now Texas. But that rather than adapt to the existing culture, these mostly illegal immigrants declared independence from Mexico in 1836, and we managed to acquire, via the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe, Colorado, New Mexico, California, all of Texas, and parts of Nevada and Utah. And then we promptly continued to insist on Euro-American culture rather than the existing culture and language. And even though it wasn't made official with the Bracero program of the 1940s, what that program did is it legally brought Mexican farm workers to work in the US because we were shorthanded because of the war. That arrangement had been existing for years, quote, illegally. So I just need to reiterate again that all this talk of who is an American and who can become an American makes me very nervous. And there are several reasons. And first of all, I'm first generation in this country. My parents fled Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied Holland. The rhetoric of present-day nativists harkens back to the rhetoric that preceded World War II. And because I have that knowledge, I'm also outraged, not only that we interned Japanese persons who were citizens during World War II, but that we are now detaining children as young as 3 months old, separated by their parents in, quote, detention or influx centers. By all reports, the conditions in these places are inhumane. The staff is taught that these children are bad, and these children suffer abuse. They are not allowed any physical contact. Sister and brother cannot hold hands. They are not allowed to pick up a crying baby. Our nation, our tax dollars are rounding up children who have come to our borders seeking refuge, asylum, a life that is not marked by starvation, by war, by gang violence, or rape, or other abuses. And we have responded by treating them not as survivors, but as perpetrators of the heinous crime of wanting refuge. I'm not sure how persons who hold the modern day version of nativism can profess to be persons of faith. I'm not sure what Bible they've been reading, because this is what I grew up with. Exodus 22:20. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress them, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Exodus 23:9. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of a stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. And the one that summarizes it all from Leviticus. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong them. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love them as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I think that kind of says it all. So we seem to have this collective amnesia that we were all once strangers in foreign lands, that we all too are immigrants. And that the price of being an immigrant is welcome, hospitality, reciprocity, kindness, compassion. And for any of you who think that emigrating is something that is done lightly, listen to the words of the Somalian British writer Warsan Shire, who says, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." Poverty, starvation, disease, torture, war, aren't all of these the mouth of the shark? Why is it that if we're all immigrants, it seems that our instinct, having arrived at the promised land, is to slam the door shut behind us and to build walls and gates and fences and pass laws and create covenants and restrictions and cultural norms, anything to keep the newest other out? Why is the first response to anything new or different often fear, as opposed to curiosity and wonder? Now, I know you're going to think this is kind of maybe foolish of me to spend some of my time watching a cartoon movie during the work week, but I remember this film I'd seen several years ago. It was called The Croods. And it's a movie about a caveman family, literally caveman, and their journey out of their caves into the light and a verdant world. But the father, prior to that transition, has taught them this: remember, fear keeps us alive. Be afraid. And every time he encounters something new, his first response is to try and fight it, to be the first to be the aggressor, to try and frighten that which is new or different. And when he first experiences rain, he tries to fight it with his fists, to no avail, which confuses him. They even have a family formation called the kill circle. He says, cavemen don't need ideas. We have fists. Ideas are for weaklings. Am I nuts, or does this 2013 cartoon echo the language being tried out by the commander-in-chief of this country? Can we learn from this cartoon, this movie, that a circle can expand not to be a kill circle, but to include not just family, but those who were once considered other? That the circle is not a kill circle, it's a live circle. And that circle is no longer just about being a citizen of one family, one tribe, one nation, but of being a global citizen. So what do we have to fear from persons fleeing persecution? Especially in cases perhaps where our country has historically helped create the conditions of that persecution. Think back to the 1980s in Latin America. What do we have to fear from a 3-month-old baby? Why are we creating immigration policies and laws based on fear? Ann Bridgman, who's a member of our congregation, who's taken on learning about and exposing the detention of children who are child asylum seekers, told me about that 3-month-old who's in detention, who had been separated from their mother. And what government does that? Even if you're not a person of faith, who may take to heart some of those biblical mandates I just quoted, do we not as human beings have a moral obligation to receive the immigrant? Has any form of nativism ultimately advanced or benefited any nation state over the course of its history? My parents never talked about their pasts or even about their journeys from their respective homelands to this country. English was the only language spoken in our home. But I have found out that my mother came with her mother via freighter through Ellis Island, and that my mother had scarlet fever at the time and was terrified that she would not be able to come into this country and would instead be sent back to Germany. My parents, like so many other immigrants, traded their histories, traded all that was familiar for life, a life of assimilation into the culture of this country. Being Dutch, being German, it's a thing of the past. They were Americans. We always flew the American flag. on the 4th of July. Always. You weren't going to confuse who we were. We were not going to be mistaken for the other. I'm sure that some of you who are sitting here are first generation also. That you are the children of refugees, of immigrants, of persons who are fleeing for their lives. Perhaps you yourself are a refugee or an immigrant or an emigre. That some of you grew up in homes where a language or languages other than English were spoken. In homes where the English that was spoken was an accented language. Maybe there was a language that you thought should be spoken that never was. Maybe your grandparents, your aunts and uncles never learned to speak English, and maybe you had to be the one to translate for them so they could buy something in the store or understand something official that had been sent to them. Maybe stories from another country, memories come alive, were shared and instilled in you. Maybe there were pictures hidden away in some album that visually spoke a story that you never heard told. Or maybe you grew up with absolute silence about anything other than the present and no sense of a past. So my question is, does assimilation have to be the price of immigration? Is there an American culture we must all conform to? And if so, what is it? And so what if today's immigrant wants to speak their own language, wear the clothes of their faith, worship at their own temples or mosques or churches, bring their perspective to bear on issues, even if they may differ from mainstream America, again, whatever that is? What I do know is that the key to the survival of any species, and I learned this from a park ranger at Glacier National Park, is diversity. I also know that the metaphor for this country is no longer the melting pot, where all vestiges of another culture or any individuality is melted down into a seemingly homogeneous identity. The more apt metaphor is that of a stew, with each spice not only adding the flavor of the stew, but necessary for it to be a stew. Now, my father would take a piece of white Pepperidge Farm bread, and he would smear it with butter. And then he would take chocolate. He would take 4 pieces and he'd put it 4 quarters. And then he would take a strawberry and put it on the 4 quarters. And then he would cut it into the 4 quarters. And one morning as an early child, as I was staring at him doing this, he said, "That's how they do it in Holland. Bet you never thought of that, huh? It's delicious." Now, I'm being somewhat facetious by using this example of what diversity can bring. But all species evolve to adapt and survive. What if we saw those who we label as other, and whose ways and whose stories we don't understand, but maybe have particular insights and knowledge? What if we saw them not as a threat to our survival, but as a way to ensure that we not only thrive, but we stay alive? So I think about those children held in our detention centers. I think about how hard it must have been to leave everything behind they have ever known, everything familiar, to travel north to the dream of a safer, better chance to make a life for themselves. How so many knew only their native languages, not even Spanish or English. Did you know that it's 1,616 miles from Honduras to our southern border? Where does the courage come to begin that journey? And how many of us in this room would be able to physically survive that journey? Sleeping wherever, fueled only by an amorphous hope, hungry and thirsty? How many bodies of those who could not complete the journey are still scattered in the desert? Or perhaps they arrive exhausted, disoriented at the border of the promised land, only to be held in detention, where some look at immigrants as opportunity seekers who only want to skim off of our social service benefits. I would invite those folks to look at the cost that each one of those folks is paying by immigrating. So what is that cost? The cost to flee? Not the financial cost. I'm talking about the emotional and psychic cost. What does it mean to start over with mostly nothing? What does it mean to be a lawyer or a doctor in your native land, only to either have to go through school all over again to become that professional in this country or never be able to practice again? To settle for taxi driving or serving fast food or cleaning the toilets in the hospital? What does it mean to speak in a language not one's own? The language that held lullabies and poetry and stories that are lost in translation. What does it mean to lose a physical sense of place and connection to a land? To go, say, like the Lost Boys of Sudan, to Minnesota. Where are the elders, the wisdom keepers of your tribe, who hold the stories that remind you of who you are? Where are the familiar foods that nourish your body and your spirit? Where is the sanctuary, the house of worship, which when you enter reminds you of what you are bound to? What's it like to ask, am I now free or am I in exile? Will there always be this aching emptiness inside me? Will there always be a longing for what was home? Will the nightmares ever stop? Is there any lullaby that one can sing to a terrorized child as they flee? To know that you will always live among, yet somehow always be apart from. Again, Warshonshire. I know a few things to be true. I do not know where I am going. Where I have come from is disappearing. I am unwelcome, and my beauty is not beauty here. My body is burning with the shame of not belonging. If we believe, as did the early humanists of the 20th century, that basically it's up to us to eradicate suffering and ensuring that justice is something that will prevail, then you know what? We better darn well get busy. And if we are people who pray, then we need to pray hard. And if we are people who act, then we need to act. If we are a people whose hands give life the shape of justice, then we had better get to it.